The murderer who was captured after escaping from law enforcement is now back in North Carolina. Dwayne Manning was extradited to Columbus County after he was arrested in Georgia. Manning got away from probation and parole officers while being taken to the county jail for a parole violation. Investigators in Georgia found him 5 days later. They say he was driving a stolen car. Then they realized he was a fugitive from our state. Manning was on parole for a homicide conviction in 1994. He now faces charges including larceny and resisting a public officer.